Let's begin today's lecture with a pivotal moment in Canadian history, the women's suffrage movement. This wasn't just about voting rights, but about broader justice and access to education, healthcare, and safety from violence. A major legal milestone came with the Persons case in 1929, when 5 women challenged the law to recognize women as persons under Canadian legislation. Their victory marked a shift toward greater political inclusion. Despite progress, issues like violence against women, including cyber violence, remain serious concerns in Canada. This ongoing struggle for justice was reflected in the 2017 Women's March, when over 5 million people worldwide rallied for women's rights and against rising political extremism. Oppression today often operates subtly through everyday rules, norms, and assumptions. It isn't always obvious or intentional, but it's embedded in how our institutions work. That's where critical social theory comes in. It helps us understand how systems of power function and how we can transform them. This approach highlights the importance of awareness, individual and collective agency, and the idea that liberation is for everyone, not just a reversal of who holds power. As we begin this course, we'll keep returning to these ideas: justice, equity, participation, and the need to unpack how oppression really works in society. To better understand how oppression works in modern society, we turn to a framework developed by Iris Young. She argued that in well-meaning liberal societies, oppression often goes unnoticed, not because it's absent, but because it's built into everyday norms, assumptions, and institutional practices. We often assume oppression is always direct and intentional, but that's not always the case. It's frequently systemic, embedded in rules and routines that feel neutral, but consistently harm certain groups. Young outlined 5 forms of oppression, each tied to an abuse of power, and most marginalized groups will experience at least one, if not more, of these. 1. Exploitation is when people's labor, time, or energy is used unfairly, especially when they aren't fairly compensated. Think of jobs where workers are underpaid or not recognized for their contributions, particularly in service or caregiving roles, often held by marginalized groups. 2. Marginalization refers to pushing entire groups to the edges of society, whether that's racialized people, people with disabilities, or others excluded from full social, economic, or political participation. 3. Powerlessness happens when people lack the ability to influence decisions that affect their lives. This often includes limited access to rights, information, or leadership roles. Over time, this can lead to internalized oppression, a belief that one's voice or value doesn't matter. Number 4, cultural imperialism is about the dominant group defining what's normal. Their values and experiences shape media, language, and policy, while other perspectives are ignored or stereotyped. It's a subtle but powerful way of silencing alternative worldviews. 5. Violence includes not only physical attacks, but also the constant threat of violence or symbolic aggression, like ridicule, intimidation, or harassment, used to maintain fear and control. Understanding these 5 faces helps us move beyond narrow definitions of oppression. It shows us how deep-rooted and multidimensional injustice can be, and why addressing it requires more than surface-level solutions. Let's talk about stereotypes, those simplified labels we often use to describe people or situations. At first glance, they may seem harmless, even convenient. But when we rely on them, we're reducing complex individuals to a few generalized traits, also known as mental cookie cutters. We take the vast diversity within a group and compress it into a single narrow mold. Stereotypes are easy to use. They save us the effort of thinking deeply or questioning assumptions. For example, think about the first words that come to mind when you hear terms like rock concert, senior citizen, or tattoos. Chances are some of those words are stereotypes. They might have a small basis in truth, but they're massively overgeneralized and erase individual differences. That's where the harm lies. When we say women are bad drivers or sociology lectures are boring, we're ignoring the women who drive exceptionally well or the professors who make learning dynamic and fun. The problem isn't just inaccuracy. It's the way stereotypes flatten the full humanity of others. A major contributor to this is the media. Television, movies, magazines, and the internet. These platforms shape how we see the world. often without us realizing it. One study of 26 Disney movies found repeated patterns. Male characters express emotion through action, are naturally heroic, and don't engage in domestic work. Female characters are admired for beauty, seek male protection, focus on marriage, and are often judged harshly if they don't fit the ideal. Even body type is stereotyped. Thin characters are admired, while larger characters are portrayed as mean, slow, or unattractive. This matters because when children grow up seeing these patterns over and over, they start to believe that this is just how men and women are supposed to be. These images set standards for what's considered normal or acceptable behavior, especially when they're not questioned. Ultimately, stereotypes are not just inaccurate. They're powerful tools that shape how we think about gender, race, age, and ability. And because they're so embedded in culture, challenging them requires active reflection, especially on how media influence our beliefs without us realizing it. Next, let's explore the concept of prejudice, which builds on what we've already discussed with stereotypes, but takes it a step further. Prejudice involves prejudging people based on faulty or rigid generalizations. It's often based on race, gender, religion, ability, or other social traits, and it's usually negative. While stereotypes are about assumptions, prejudice involves feelings, dislike, distrust, or discomfort directed at individuals or groups. If you're annoyed at your roommate for being messy, that's not prejudice. It's a personal issue. But if your frustration is tied to their religion or ethnicity, that's where prejudice comes into play. Prejudice often stems from ethnocentrism, the belief that your own cultural norms are normal and others are strange, wrong, or inferior. A great way to understand this is through the Dr. Seuss story of the Sneetches. Some Sneetches had stars on their bellies, and they believed this made them superior. The plain-bellied Sneetches were excluded, mocked, and denied access to social events. Eventually, the obsession with status symbols, adding and removing stars, exposed the foolishness of their prejudice. The story ends with the realization that differences shouldn't define how we treat one another. That's what ethnocentrism does. It justifies exclusion by declaring one way of life superior. This mindset shows up in many isms, like racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, and so on. While these attitudes don't always lead directly to discrimination, they often lay the groundwork for unfair treatment. They shape how people are spoken to, represented in media, hired at work, or treated in daily life. That's why human rights education doesn't just target actions. It also addresses the underlying attitudes that lead to bias and harm. To understand how oppression shows up in everyday life, think of light passing through a prism. Just as white light splits into a spectrum, social categories like race, age, or gender pass through society's lens and emerge as isms. For example, age becomes ageism, not just a trait, but a way of devaluing people based on age. The same happens with race, gender, ability, and class. These categories are shaped by power, norms, and perception. This is what we mean by the ism prism. Identity characteristics are refracted by society's attitudes and structures, producing systems of oppression. These isms come from the interaction between stereotypes, prejudice, and power. They aren't random. They emerge because dominant groups set the standard, pushing others to the margins. The result, as differences are defined as abnormal, more isms form, reinforcing inequality. This framework helps us see oppression not as isolated incidents, but as part of a systematic pattern, one that privileges some identities while undermining others. To understand how oppression shows up in everyday life, think of light passing through a prism. Just as white light splits into a spectrum, social categories like race, age, or gender pass through society's lens and emerge as isms. These systems of discrimination often overlap, but each reflects how social power is exercised in distinct ways. Ableism refers to biases against people with disabilities, whether physical, emotional, or cognitive. Discrimination isn't just about the disability itself, but the stigma that surrounds it. Studies show that people with visible or recorded disabilities often face hiring and promotion barriers, even for past diagnoses. Ageism targets both older and younger populations. Seniors are often viewed as fragile or outdated, while youth may be dismissed as irresponsible. Legal protections exist, but age discrimination, like being passed over for a job or marginalized in volunteer roles, remains widespread. Classism is the systemic oppression based on socioeconomic status. It includes attitudes like believing poor people are lazy or less capable. Research shows that students perceived to be from lower income backgrounds may be unfairly judged, even when their performance is equal or better. Heterosexism positions heterosexuality as the norm and invalidates other sexual identities. A notable case in Canada involved a high school student being denied the right to bring his boyfriend to prom. While legal action led to a win, the emotional toll of such discrimination can be devastating, sometimes with fatal consequences, as seen in anti-LGBTQ bullying cases. Racism is not just personal bias, it's supported by institutional power. Race, though biologically meaningless, is socially constructed in ways that exclude and devalue racialized individuals. Examples range from whitewashing in media to altering public imagery, such as the redesign of Canada's $100 bill, to avoid reflecting racial diversity. Sexism is the belief that one gender is superior to another. A study found that identical resumes sent to science professors, one with a male name and the other female, received significantly different ratings, with the male applicant rated as more competent and offered a higher salary. These biases help explain gender gaps in male-dominated fields. Sizeism involves discrimination based on body size, especially against those who are overweight. From media portrayals to hiring practices, weight bias is pervasive. A U.S. aerobics instructor successfully challenged a fitness company's policy requiring instructors to look fit. Yet in Canada, there's still no legal protection against size-based discrimination. Together, these isms show us how power operates across different dimensions of identity. Recognizing them is essential for dismantling systemic inequality. Now, let's turn to discrimination, which often follows from prejudice. Discrimination involves actions or policies that result in unequal treatment, whether that's in hiring, education, housing, or access to services. In Canada, we have strong legal protections under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Human Rights Act. These laws guarantee protection from discrimination based on race, religion, age, gender, ability, sexual orientation, and other characteristics. Discrimination can be subtle or blatant. For example, a bank may make it harder for newcomers to get loans, discrimination based on race and origin. A worker is fired after announcing her pregnancy, discrimination based on sex. An employer requires a driver's license for all roles, excluding capable workers with disabilities, disability-based discrimination. A person denied a job despite receiving a pardon for a past conviction, discrimination based on record. These are just a few examples, but they show how biases are often built into policies or practices, not just attitudes. Employers and service providers have a duty to accommodate people's needs based on these protected grounds. That could mean offering alternate formats for people with visual disabilities or adjusting schedules for religious observance. However, accommodation isn't unlimited. If meeting someone's needs would cause undue hardship due to safety concerns or extreme costs, then exceptions can apply. But the bar is high, and the burden of proof is on the employer or institution. For example, a university had to cover $40,000 interpretation services for a deaf student. The cost wasn't enough to prove undue hardship. It's also important to know that each province and territory has its own human rights commission or tribunal. These bodies handle complaints in areas like housing, education, and employment. And finally, human rights laws generally take precedence over other legislation. Just saying we were following another law isn't usually a valid defense for discrimination. The takeaway here is that discrimination is not just about individual bias, it's also about systems, and those systems are legally required to ensure fairness, equity, and respect for all. Discrimination is the unequal treatment of individuals or groups based on characteristics such as race, age, gender, religion, disability, or family status. It can arise from bias, stereotypes, or policies that fail to assess people based on their actual capacities and needs. For example, a landlord might refuse to rent to a family with children, assuming kids are messy or noisy. Even if the family is clean, reliable, and pays rent on time, this assumption leads to exclusion based on a group identity rather than an individual evaluation. One important aspect of discrimination under Canadian law is that intent is not required for it to occur. Someone might not mean to discriminate, but if the effect of their action results in unfair treatment, it can still be considered discrimination. For instance, hiring an employee because they observe a religious holiday, even if the policy appears neutral, can still be discriminatory if it doesn't allow for necessary accommodation. Similarly, requiring a standardized test for a job that disadvantages newcomers due to cultural bias could be discriminatory, even if it wasn't designed to exclude anyone. Discrimination can take several forms. Direct discrimination is when a person is openly treated unfairly because of a protected characteristic. An example is denying someone housing because of their race or firing a woman due to pregnancy. Indirect discrimination happens when a seemingly neutral rule or policy creates unequal outcomes. For instance, a dress code that prohibits all headwear may unintentionally exclude people whose religion requires them to wear head coverings. Systemic discrimination is often the most difficult to detect. It refers to practices or policies within institutions that, over time, disadvantage particular groups, even if unintentionally. These practices may appear fair on the surface, but actually reinforce existing social inequalities. Systemic barriers are often embedded in hiring practices, education systems, and service delivery models. For example, applicants with names perceived as non-Western may consistently receive fewer interview invitations, despite having the same qualifications as other candidates. This points to bias that operates within the system, not just at the individual level. In Canada, human rights laws protect against discrimination at both federal and provincial levels. The Canadian Human Rights Act and provincial codes prohibit discrimination and establish the duty to accommodate, which means organizations must adjust their practices to ensure equal access, unless doing so would cause undue hardship. This might involve offering materials in accessible formats or modifying schedules for religious observance. However, accommodations must be based on protected grounds under the law and supported where reasonably possible. The threshold for proving undue hardship is high. It requires showing that the accommodation would fundamentally alter operations or create serious safety or financial risks. Overall, discrimination is not always overt or malicious. It is often embedded in the assumptions and routines of everyday life. Addressing it requires careful attention to how our systems are structured and who they are built to serve. Equity depends on recognizing not just individual bias, but the broader patterns that shape how opportunities are distributed. Ending oppression isn't something that can be achieved through a single method or action. Oppression is complex and multidimensional. It exists in personal experiences, in cultural narratives, and within structural systems. That means any effort to challenge oppression must happen at all of those levels, simultaneously. It's not enough to intervene in just one area without considering how it connects to the others. This is why anti-oppressive practice calls for a continuous and dynamic approach. Actions at the personal level, like recognizing our own biases, must be informed by an understanding of larger cultural patterns and systemic structures, and vice versa. Real change happens when those layers inform each other and we're aware of how power operates across them. An important part of this work is acknowledging that we all carry some level of socially constructed privilege. And at different times and in different contexts, we may find ourselves both in positions of privilege and in positions of marginalization. What matters is whether we choose to ignore that privilege or use it to help dismantle the systems that created it. One of the biggest obstacles to change is silence. When people don't speak out about injustice, when we ignore, avoid, or stay neutral, oppression is able to continue. Speaking out doesn't just disrupt silence, it opens up space for reflection, analysis, and collective action. This is how the process of human liberation unfolds. We begin by acknowledging that something is wrong, we examine why it's happening, we develop strategies, and then we take action, together. This process isn't linear, it's cyclical. After action comes another round of reflection, learning, and organizing. Each step strengthens our understanding and sharpens our strategy, and it's this process that fuels long-term transformation. An important part of this process is becoming an ally. Being an ally means recognizing one's own unearned advantage in society and taking responsibility for challenging the systems that produce it. This isn't about guilt, it's about accountability. True allies understand that power isn't something to hold over others. It's something we can share, something we can use to amplify the voices and efforts of those most affected by oppression. Being an ally also means showing up in solidarity, not taking over. It means recognizing that lived experience matters and that communities affected by oppression should be at the center of defining the issues, the goals, and the solutions. Whether we're addressing ableism, racism, sexism, or other forms of inequality, the work of allyship is grounded in humility, learning, and collective responsibility. Ultimately, challenging oppression requires all of us. It calls for reflection, courage, and a willingness to shift the power structures that shape our lives. When we step into that work, not as saviors, but as co-creators of change, we begin to move closer to a just and equitable society for all.